Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we have discontinued our in-person events and instituted these online webinars. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we're now dependent on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at our website, globaljusticecenter.org. We have been doing a weekly webinar. I think this is webinar number 30 or 40 rather. So since the pandemic, we've been doing these webinars on a variety of topics. This has included a series on racism. On August 3rd, we did a webinar on racism and identity with Linda Alcoff and okay, you almost lost me there. And on January 4th, we did a webinar, Combating Racism, with Lewis Gordon, Fred Evans, and yours truly. Today, we are happy to have two political scientists, Harry Targ and Valeria Sinclair Chapman,
I guess I should.
who will discuss the connections between the history of the United States political economy, the construction of race, and the institutionalization of racism, politically and culturally. The rise of Trumpism is related to this history of white supremacy. What are the problems and prospects of combating it in the new Biden administration? These include legislation around reparations, inequality in the incidences of the pandemic and responses to it, assistance to small business and the poor, and the possibilities of renewed fusion politics around Reverend William Barber's New Poor People's Campaign.
Enjoy your reading day. And
if there's someone who has another device on, we're getting an echo from it, so please turn off your other devices and mute your microphone, except for our two speakers who I now want to introduce. Valeria Sinclair Chapman is at Purdue University as associate professor in the political science department. She's also director of the Center for Research on Diversity and Inclusion and a member of the editorial board of the American Political Science Review. Our first speaker, though, will be Harry Targ, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Purdue University. He's active in the Committee of Correspondence on Democracy and Socialism, has published extensively on U.S. foreign policy, especially Cuba. And it was through that Cuba connection that I first met Harry years ago, since he has been to Cuba a number of times on the trips that we used to be able to sponsor to Cuba. So without any further ado, let me turn the mic over to Harry. He already has his PowerPoint up here on screen share. And so take it away, Harry.
Okay, thank you very much, Cliff. The first point I want to make is over the last 2 weeks, I was on 3 Zoom calls in which I was disconnected. So if I get disconnected, I want to apologize in advance. It's not because I disdain any comments that you may make. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed that nothing will happen. And I switched to an iPad mini, and heaven knows how that will perform. Secondly, I always appreciate hanging out with the people from the Center for Global Justice, including particularly Cliff Duran and Bob Stone and Betsy Bowman and all the other folks who I've met through associating with the center and the Cuba trips. Third, I'm really excited to be on a panel with my friend and colleague Valeria Sinclair Chapman, and we've engaged in scholarly activities and some political activism that you might hear about as we go along. I have a PowerPoint presentation, which originally was part of a longer time period. And so I'm going to just briefly share some of the slides and skip over some of the others. But if you find the information of any use value, you could write me at target@purdue.edu to get the complete slide set. I'm interested in looking at the concept of racism from the vantage point of what we used to call in another subfield levels of analysis. In my judgment, we talk a lot about racism intermixing different levels, different approaches, different disciplines, if you will. And I think we could usefully look at racism from the standpoint of global political economy, political institutions, culture, and social psychology. And I'd like to just share a few images and thoughts about each of these, and concentrating particularly on the political economy. I then want to show you some data very, very briefly on the economic dimensions of both class exploitation and racism in the United States, and end with a very brief discussion of a variety of social movements that have struggled against racism and classism as well. And Valeria will be talking more about this last aspect, and I'm sure we'll be addressing the 2021 and where we need to go from here. So let me show you some of these slides and some of the arguments that I want to make. First, I like to begin with the very rudimentary analysis of capitalism that, for the most part, Marx offered up for our consideration, that capitalism emerges in a stage of economic change in the 14th and 15th century, and Marx called it the age of primitive accumulation. And you all know this, that from the Marxian point of view, a capitalist system is a system built on profit, and profit fundamentally comes from expropriating the value of goods and services produced by workers. Many workers get paid a wage, but other workers in the era, particularly of primitive accumulation, worked as slaves, did not even secure a wage. And to maintain this system, to avoid resistance to it, categories are constructed to divide the potential of working class rebellion. Here are a few, I think, dynamite quotes that I always like to refer to. This is from Marx in Volume 1 of Capital. The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and atonement in minds of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. And these images provided by my friend Carl Davidson, who works on PowerPoint a lot, reflect upon the expropriation of the land of Native people in the Western Hemisphere and the enslavement of workers in Bolivia for the extraction of silver mining for the Spanish colonial powers. With this era of primitive accumulation, Marx says slavery is an economic category like any other. Without slavery, you have no cotton. Without cotton, you have no modern industry. It is slavery that gave the colonies their value. A parallel theorist who interests me is Frantz Fanon. I'm sure many of you have read Fanon's work, and I've been impressed by the interpretation of Fanon by a Fanon scholar, Peter Hudis, who many of us know. And he talked about Fanon's conception of the relationship between class and race, reflected in this quote. Since capitalism was shaped from its inception by racial factors, it is not possible to effectively oppose it without making the struggle against racism primary. And this is a really dense quote. And again, if you want to see more, you could, I'd be glad to send you the slides. The third theorist who intrigues me, although I must confess not having read the whole body of his work, is a non-academic historian by the name of Ted Allen, who wrote a couple of large volumes on what he called the invention of the white race. And he did detailed historical scholarship in the United States, going back to the period of colonial America. And he argues fundamentally that, that race and racism and the white race were constructions, and that race, in fact, was socially constructed. He argued that the concept of race did not appear in any colonial documents in the United States until Bacon's Rebellion in 1677. And it was at that point in time when slaves and indentured servants rose up against landowners to demand the justifiable redistribution of the wealth derived from their land. And Ted Allen argues after that one begins to see in colonial records reference to race. So what you get from Ted Allen is the notion that race is socially constructed. This is not an idea that's unique to us, but I think is worth considering at length. If we move from the level of political economy, and indeed we talked about global political economy because the slave system was one that connected a variety of continents and helped facilitate a global trade system, to matters of political institutions, we see the institutionalization of white supremacy in our most prestigious American institutions. The Constitution, the legitimization of the slave system in the South, the emergence of Jim Crow, and discrimination in virtually every walk of life, including in our own day voter suppression and other manifestations. There are only occasional interregnums where political institutions move against the institutionalized patterns of white supremacy. And the first Reconstruction after the Civil War is one example. And we'll return to Reconstructions momentarily. That first Reconstruction is vividly portrayed in a novel by Howard Fast called Freedom Road, which is still relevant, a fictionalized account of the early post-Civil War period where interracial political institutions were being established in the South, and the very useful work by Eric Foner on Reconstruction, and of course, W.E.B. Du Bois. A third level that I think is worthy of addressing is the cultural level of racism. That is to say, we have for hundreds of years the development of collective narratives about whiteness and blackness, and you see images here of the first motion picture, D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, which, as I remember, was shown for the first time in the White House in the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. Amos and Andy was the most popular radio program in the 1930s. And then, of course, you have the imagery of the well-known film Gone with the Wind. So what we see in the cultural narratives in the 19th, 20th, and 21st century is an institutionalization of the idea of racial superiority and inferiority. I add a third level, I call it political psychology. And here we see socialized in the consciousness of the American people, mythologies about white supremacy, the white man's burden, American exceptionalism, and it relates both to whites and African Americans, but of course it relates to whites and virtually all people across the face of the globe. And we see sort of subtle renditions of it even today. One of the arguments, one of the elements of discourse and expressions of shock in reference to the Trump administration is the argument that the Trump administration besmirched the image of the United States as the world's greatest democracy in the world today. And this implicitly, it seems to me, is a manifestation of this same consciousness of white supremacy that Fanon argues deeply embeds itself into the consciousness of all people, such that Fanon argued in a controversial way in one of his books that Black people needed to, at least figuratively, kill whites to liberate themselves from their own sense of inferiority. So this constitutes, from my point of view, different levels of analysis and explanation of racism, from global political economy to national political economy to the development of American political institutions, to culture and to social psychology. And I presented this list of sort of different levels of analysis because I first spoke with a group called the Diversity Roundtable, and I wanted to communicate my belief that their work against struggles against racism might take a variety of different perspectives. And while I see, as Marx and Fanon did, the interconnectedness of class and race and capitalism, imperialism, and racism, work at the level of cultural and social psychology and political change was indeed also very relevant. Some of the impacts of racism were documented for me in an excellent volume prepared by the Institute for Policy Studies called Dreams Deferred. And this you could access online, get a PDF of it. And it's about a 50, 60 page document with a whole array of data on how the enrichment of the top 1% increases both the inequality and declining living conditions of all Americans, but particularly African Americans. And so some of these slides show some of this data. Over the past 3 decades, a polarizing racial wealth divide has grown between white households and households of color. And it goes on to indicate that median wealth of Blacks and Latino families has declined. Median income of white families have declined, but not nearly as much as African Americans. So, and then this little graphic points to the fact that the Forbes 400 richest Americans own more wealth than all Black households, plus a quarter of Latino households. Overcoming racism and exploitation and I think this probably will be central to much of our discussion, is I identify at various historical points different efforts to struggle against racism based upon some kind of recognition that there's an inextricable connection between class exploitation and racism. I've done some prior work on progressive trade unions in the CIO period. The United Packing House Workers of America was the example that I dealt with at length. The packing house workers in the 1930s realized that prior efforts to organize workers in meatpacking plants all failed because of the division of the working class by race. This goes all the way back to Upton Sinclair's fictional characterization of efforts to organize in his novel, The Jungle. But in the 1930s, racial unity and multiracial unity was a centerpiece of the political strategy and organizing of the packing house workers that led them to successfully unionize major meatpacking plants throughout the country from a period of the late 1930s till the 1960s or 70s. There's a recent book by Tony Gilpin called The Deep Grudge, which is a history of the farm equipment workers, primarily organizing them into unions in the international harvester plants throughout the Midwest. And there's a long and vivid portrait of FE farm equipment workers struggling against racism in Louisville, Kentucky, and struggling against racial segregation. And the centerpiece of the argument about the example of the packing house workers, farm equipment workers, and some other unions was a full recognition of the inextricable connection between class and race. I also looked, and here is a reference to a blog essay of mine where I compared the 10-point program of the Black Panther Party, which was developed in the mid-1960s, that addressed questions of community control, healthcare, economic equity, opposition to police violence, a whole panoply of issues that connected economics with politics. And it was decidedly based upon a critique of capitalism as well as racial supremacy. And then in this article, I also compare the Black Panther Party program to the program of Black Lives Matter, which indeed connects issues of white supremacy and capitalist exploitation as well, a real commonality over time in these two varied programs. I was interested also in efforts of whites to organize for racial justice, and they too have programs that see the connection between economics and racism. Standing Up for Racial Justice, SURGE, is a national organization with chapters all around the country. And this quote from Ann Braden, who was a significant political force in the struggle against racism in the South, is an inspiration for SURGE. And finally, Valeria and I worked about 5-6 years ago in an effort to create a Moral Mondays campaign in Indiana. And most of you know that Reverend Barber, with a group initially of 6 organizations in North Carolina, came together to organize multi-issue campaigns that addressed issues of race and class. And their initial grassroots work led to the creation of a larger North Carolina Moral Mondays campaign with about 150 affiliate organizations. 2 theoretical arguments, and I'm sure Valeria will develop them further, is Reverend Barber's idea of fusion politics. And fusion politics is based upon the proposition that there are a variety of issues that concern us: racism and white supremacy, economic exploitation, environmental devastation, homophobia, gender exploitation. And Barber argues that there's an interconnectivity between the root causes of all these issues, and therefore there's a necessity for different groups to fuse, to work together to bring about change. The Moral Mondays campaign in the last couple of years has been transposed into a new Poor People's campaign. And the new Poor People's campaign, sort of modeled after the Poor People's campaign of 1968, is an attempt to bring together these issues around class and race and gender and homophobia in a way to more effectively challenge the multiplicity of evils that Dr. King referred to in his speeches in 1967. So I'm ready to stop here, except when I first prepared these remarks, in the aftermath of preparation of these remarks, I added a few slides to address the issues of 2020. And just to refer to them: mass incarceration, the enormous increase in mass incarceration, largely of people of color. And secondly, the differential impacts of the coronavirus on people by race. And this was an early quote from Dr. Linda Murray, who served as a medical practitioner in Cook County. And 2/3 of the early deaths of people from COVID-19 were African American. And then voter suppression. And I'll end with what I think is a kind of inspiring image. These were voters in the city of Milwaukee who doggedly decided to go out to vote, despite the dangers of not being able to be 6 feet apart, socially distanced, because they thought voting was so terribly important to change the system. So thank you for your attention, and Valeria can take it over from here.
Okay, Harry, thank you. If you'll take your screen down, Valeria, let me turn the floor over to you. Oh, you're going to start at the end, huh?
Me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Were you not able to hear me when I had my earbuds in? No? Okay.
This is the first we've heard of you.
Ah, well, I have been talking, so there we go. Okay. That's good to know. All right. So first of all, I want to thank the Center for Global Justice for the invitation to participate in this talk. And I think I should also thank Harry Targ, my wonderful colleague, who it is just difficult to say no to. And he is the very reason that I am really doing this additional work, specifically on fusion politics and diversity and coalitions. It's because Harry years ago invited me to a single meeting. Just come and see what they have to say about this guy Barber and Moral Mondays movement coming out of North Carolina, where I'm from. Here I am years later, still looking at similar kinds of questions. So I'm gonna start off the talk with a little bit about America's changing electorate, and then we'll talk some about fusion politics. So we'll just take a look at the overview. And there may be some places where I have to move kind of quickly, because as I put the presentation together, I realized it was quite a bit of material. And I will say that I have some additional slides if we need to see them on exit poll data from the 2020 election, that most of which I'm not going to show in the talk. So we'll start with, I think, building on the
Oh my God.
Woo! Okay, Harry, you probably want to mute. Oh, I don't know who that was. But I hope whoever that was is okay. And so in any case, so we'll start with a look at America's changing electorate over the last several years. We'll consider the prospects for fusion politics and diverse coalitions. We will look specifically at Moral Mondays as a kind of case study, and then we'll think a bit about a concept that I call knitting together movements, which I think is a mechanism for sustainable diverse coalitions. And then I'd like to propose that we look ahead to where we are now and why the big lie was so supported across the Republican Party at the national and state levels, perhaps even at the local level. It makes sense politically. I think it's highly costly for the nation. And then we'll try to draw some conclusions that hopefully can lead to some robust discussion. And I will say, I don't know who Stephen or Cliff, if you can kind of give me a heads up when I have 5 minutes. So thank you. Okay. So to begin, in terms of America's changing electorate, if we look back prior to the 2020 election, what we see is that over the first 2 decades of the 21st century, the growth in American voters has come from people of color. So Latinx populations, Blacks, and people of Asian descent, along with less growth. We see a percent change of about 6% for other groups, Native Americans and other indigenous populations. I would say that demography is not destiny, no matter what you hear. We could easily think of the politics of South Africa, for example, to know that. But that there is some potential for real change in this country over the next half century at least. And we should expect the share of eligible white voters in the American electorate to shrink. There is a democratic advantage in a more diverse nation. Since the mid-1990s, the country increasingly self-identifies with the Democratic Party, with the exception of white Americans, who are almost evenly divided between the two parties when it comes to party ID. As you can see, 1819, 53% white, 53% of whites identified as Republican, 42% identifying as Democrat, while for minority populations, they are majority Democrat in ID. Again, what we see is that the differences between the two parties is stark. In 2019, non-whites made up nearly 40% of registered Democrats, right? Whereas the Republican Party is has continued to be over time far less diverse and far more white. In 2019, about 81% of the Republican Party were white non-Hispanics, and that's actually an improvement from 1996, when 96%, according to the Pew Research Center, 96% of the Republican Party was white, were white Americans. This is not an accident. We can look back to the Southern Strategy in 1968, which was really a choice of the Republican Party to abandon what had been a strategy of competing for Black votes and competing for non-white votes in this country, particularly in cities, and beginning in the late 1960s and moving into with the Nixon election and going forward, I think perfected by Reagan, perhaps even more so by the anomaly that is Donald Trump, that we have seen the expansion of the Southern strategy, kind of double downing on that strategy, even after the 2012 loss that Mitt Romney had to Barack Obama. And so that the Republican Party is majority white is no accident. That about 20% of the party, of those who identify as self-identify as Republicans or lean in the direction of the Republican Party are people of color is also intentional. The Republican Party does not want to actively compete for those voters. It just wants to skim enough off the top so that Democratic candidates cannot win in statewide and presidential elections. We can talk about that later too. Okay. I wanted to just touch on the kinds of ways that we saw this. I don't have the pictures, but when we think about what Trump's strategy related to race, it's really crass and crude. The most poignant piece of that in terms of appeals to Black voters in 2016 was for Black voters to stay home. If they weren't going to vote for him, to simply not vote. And then in 2020 was the support of the Trump campaign for Kanye's faux presidential campaign. All right, when we look here at this data related to the shifting demographics in battleground states, the states, of course, should look familiar to us. Those are the states that were targeted by Trump primarily in the aftermath of the 2020 election. You'll also see from this data why the Republican Party is viewing this change with alarm. So you'll see that, for instance, in Florida, the percent white in the state of Florida has actually declined by 13% since 2000. So in the last 2 decades, we see declining percentages of white voters in the electorate. And in order to be competitive, Republicans will need to figure out how to reshape the electorate to stem the entry of non-white voters who are crucial to their winning in elections. These battleground states typically have Republican legislatures and governors. They are the last bastion of hope for continued white dominance in US politics. And we can see this in terms of how we are going to, over the next several years, understand American citizenship, what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be a voter, what our images are of who belongs in the US polity. Here we see a discussion, some data on Black voter turnout, and we see that Black voters have turned out in large numbers, great numbers in presidential elections, most notably in 2008 and 2012. In 2008, Black voters turned out on parity with white voters for the first time. They may have exceeded them by a bit in 2008. No, in 2012. So you can see in 2012, it was 65% for both. And then in 2008 and in 2012, Black voter turnout was a little bit higher. Okay. Once again, if we consider battleground states, several of these states are Southern states and in the West. We can consider here, and we should perhaps talk about the idea of reverse migration. The idea that Blacks are moving back from the Northeast and Rust Belt states to Southern states. It had a significant effect in Georgia and in North Carolina, at least. Latinos as well in states like Arizona and in Florida. And so as these changes in population take place, we ought to be thinking ahead about how state legislatures or going to respond to the new demands that are placed on policymakers from these shifting populations. There's a whole theory about racial group threat that we could talk about, but suffice it to say that once populations, Black populations historically have increased beyond 15%, you start to see some backlash amongst elected officials until they reach numbers where Blacks or a coalition of voters can elect more favorable candidates, typically Democrats, or liberal progressive candidates. And so that is what we ought to expect as these numbers begin to shift across the country. I'm gonna go a little faster. So here we see just a quick peek at the differences between Latino voting eligible populations and turnout. As recent as 2012, there was still a gap, and in 2016, I'm sorry I don't have the updated data, but Latino turnout has not yet reached parity with their share in the voting eligible population. So that's the share of Latinos who could vote, but they are either not registered or they don't turn out to vote. And so typically is about a 10-point gap between those two values. And that certainly has an effect on the kind of turnouts that we see in national elections. The promising piece of this for Latinos is that they are a younger population. So almost 50% of Latinos are millennials. And that means over the next 2 decades, that is a prime area for a prime opportunity for coalition building, particularly with youth. Okay. In terms of shifts in voter turnout, I think we touched on this a little bit. Black Americans and whites turn out more than other racial and ethnic groups, with 2008 being a high water mark for both Blacks and Latino turnout. And in 2008 and 2012, we see that Black turnout surpassed white or reached parity. Okay. I want to shift here then to think about the prospect of this for of this information of a changing electorate, the prospect of this for multiracial coalitions and for fusion politics. So Harry and I years ago published a paper that talked about fusion politics and King and the Poor People's Campaign. And this is the definition that we have from that paper. Harry, I think, touched on this some already, but fusion politics is the idea that individuals, organizations, and issues can be connected to drive change on a national scale. It's the idea of a sustained multiracial coalition of anti-poverty, anti-racist, and anti-war activists that can redirect resources and change public policy. Okay, so Moral Mondays is the case study that I would like to give to think about how we can consider diversity as an asset in organizing, and how we might also recognize difference and organize across lines of difference. The key here is shared opposition to a common foe, and we'll come back to that in just a second. Okay, just a little bit of history on Moral Mondays. Moral Mondays started out of North Carolina with Reverend Barber, who you see here in the photo. It started off as 100,000s on Jones Street, which is a regular march that was organized in Black History Month. Reverend Barber was president of the statewide NAACP. He organized a march to the state legislature. He wanted more than banquets. He wanted to take people into the streets, begin to look at civil disobedience and other means of actually changing policy. So he started this HK on J March in 2007 to move from banquets to battle. By the time they get to 2013, HK on J is a social justice coalition of 160 partners who cover a whole wide range of issues. They develop a 14-point agenda that you can take a look at that covers everything from education to housing, affordable housing, universal healthcare, expansion of Medicaid, living wages. The Fight for 15 is one that I think that the Moral Mondays movement has really helped to elevate, environmental justice and other kinds of issues. In 2013, Moral Mondays really kind of burst into the public awareness when more than 80,000 people joined their annual Black History Month March. It was after the state legislature in North Carolina, in fact, the entire government in North Carolina moved to the Republican Party for the first time since the Reconstruction era. And this time, not only were they Republican, they were highly conservative Republican legislature. And so one of their first actions was to restrict voter access, voter laws, and to cut back or to refuse to expand Medicaid and under Obamacare, and to also move to crush unions. And so that was a key opportunity to come together. In response, the Forward Together movement, HK-on-J, organized weekly marches, these Monday marches, these calls for a moral response to the problems facing North Carolinians. And their first gathering had 80,000 people. And it continued for the next several weeks with thousands of people coming down to the Jones Street and protesting at the state legislature. They also did some other things, collecting data for testimony and voter suppression cases. They've organized across the state for voter registration and training. And now across the nation, Moral Mondays has moved across the nation. Almost every state has had a Moral Mondays movement in its state, in the union. Okay, so a key question then is whether these kinds of coalitions are sustainable or viable over the long term. And I think lots of literature which and history itself would suggest the perils of assuming that diverse coalitions will work. And so I'd like to spend just a few minutes having a conversation about that. The problems or challenges of diverse coalitions are in part related to mistrust and to power asymmetries. There are tools that we can use to address those kinds of things. And one recent example would be the Women's March. I won't talk a whole lot about it, but I can. I've worked on it in another context. Some of you may be aware that some of the original founders of the Women's March were asked to step down from leadership last year in relationship to the unwillingness of two of the founders to disavow Louis Farrakhan. And so those kinds of issues can completely derail the kinds of strong coalitions that we are hoping to build, and we need to sort out what are some strategies to avoid that. Okay, I will suggest that diversity is a value for many. I'm sure it's a value for most on this call, but there's certainly some research that suggests that it is also difficult to sustain. So you see here a quote from Putnam in 2008, Bob Putnam, and the key phrase he says is that ethnic diversity on value is an asset, as our own history in the United States demonstrates. But Wilson responds that Putnam's own data shows that in diverse contexts, neighborhoods, et cetera, Americans have tended to hunker down. We end up with less trust of our neighbors, less confidence in local government, a lower sense of our own ability to affect change. And so there are all of these other kinds of things that happen when we are in more diverse arenas where communication itself becomes more difficult. I think we have to keep that in mind. Okay, so what I would suggest, and particularly in light of Biden's call for unity, is that there is a way forward to think about unity. I'm going to suggest that we consider it as political solidarity, and that our sense of what unity should look like is unrealistically demanding. So the mechanism I'm going to suggest that we use is to knit together coalitions. Notions of unity, as we saw in the women's marches, can be excluding. You can see it in the photos here. The photo in the middle are the founders of the women's marches that and the co-directors from 2017, right? Black, Latina, Muslim, and the woman with the baby is a white woman from New York. And so these were the directors. But we see for many of the people who I work with, they saw the women's marches as really the photo that you see from the plane with the pussy hat, with the pink pussy hats, as a white women's movement, right? But it certainly could be, and I think the data actually show that it was a multiracial coalition. It faltered though because of expectations of what unity would look like to make it work. So I would suggest that our notions of coalitions are inherently fragile. We can talk about how we can address that. That unity can exclude certain ideas or people. It can be constricting, and it can really become more about policing than about learning. So what I suggest then, and Cliff, I don't have a clock in front of me, but so I'm gonna try to move more quickly here. What I suggest then is that we might use a different framework that I call knitting together movements. So we can reimagine coalition building in a way that helps us to focus on a kind of unity against a common foe, rather than the kind of naive belief that we are all going to support the same issues, right, with the same level of intensity. So for instance, not everybody has to march, not everybody has to show up, but we all have to organize in a way that helps us to move forward in our shared objectives. This approach will allow for the independence of organizations and provide for interdependence. And it should center the voices of the otherwise marginalized, but it doesn't suggest that only their voices are important. And I love the photo of Sojourner Truth, who's knitting, right? That knitting is both very deeply tied to women's work, to the work of women of color, and to the kind of connectedness that I think we need to see. So the kind of unity that I think matters here is unity of purpose, not necessarily the absolutely same ideas always. So you can have unity of purpose while you also have diverse identities. It is flexible and additive. It allows for strong and weak ties. And I'll talk about it. I'm not going to go through this as much as I'd like, but Toure and Hamilton, if you'll remember from their seminal book, Black Power, they have a chapter 4, where they talk about, it's practically a handbook for me, where they talk about coalitions. And as much as Reverend Barber talks about the possibility of cross-racial, cross-class coalitions coming out of North Carolina during the populist movements, Toure and Hamilton used the same example to say why it didn't work. That when Black voters, Black would-be voters, refused to simply go along with the leaders of the populist parties who they told them to vote for, they shut them down. And they were very supportive then of limiting or eliminating the right of Blacks to vote. And so Toure and Hamilton would suggest to us that the idea of shared interest and goodwill is not going to sustain coalition building, and that what is required is self-direction for vulnerable and marginalized groups, that they be treated as co-equals, that they have some autonomy, and that they have separate power bases. This is where I think we really get into some challenges with coalition building. Again, Ella Baker is another provides additional insight to how we might think about coalition buildings. And that is the idea that these people who are marginalized need to also be able to think and grapple with how they relate to the polity itself. And when that happens, it might not look the same way as it looks for others. We got to make room for that. So that requires some grassroots approaches to decision-making, group-centric leadership that I think kind of harkens back to the Kwame and Ture ideas about leadership. Doesn't require complete separation, but it does require some autonomy. And then this idea of reciprocity, respect, and shared risk. Finally, this idea of political solidarity by Schloss from her book in 2008, I think it's Nancy Schloss. She suggests that what we actually need is a unity toward a shared vision. So if we can keep our eyes on the prize, so to speak, then we may not need to police one another so fiercely that we remove people from our coalitions when they do not live up to our ideals about what we think they ought to do or the policies that they ought to support. So political solidarity then allows for, is more fluid. It allows for members to commit and to change their commitments, to drop out and to drop in. And so I think it is less demanding than kind of our traditional views about what coalitions might look like. Okay, so let me tell you just a little bit about knitting. And Cliff, if you might have to unmute to tell me to stop, okay? Okay, so knitting then builds on the kinds of things that I saw in watching the Moral Mondays movement, which I think is incredible. And it's been so amazing to learn about this movement, working with Harry and working with Indiana Moral Mondays and observing organizers and leaders in North Carolina and Reverend Barber in particular. So one of the things that Moral Mondays does, it has 160 organizations, it's cross-racial, multiracial and ethnic, various religions, various kinds of issues and organizations. It allows for people to create relationships with their nearby allies. So the relationships that are made between individuals and organizations that are closest to you ideologically can be the strongest, and those who are more distant from you can be weakest. So it allows for strong and weak ties. It promotes learning about others' issues. It's part of what Moral Mondays does. So they have an expectation that not only will participants pay attention to their own group's issues, but also that they will learn about someone else's. And in observing and doing a small survey at a recent, pre-COVID, last February, Moral Mondays gathering, that is what we saw. Leaders would talk about their own issues. So for instance, the Fight for 15 leadership would also talk about union organizing for teachers, right? Or the National Organization of Women might also talk about the Fight for 15. So they promoted a kind of learning and advocacy of other people's issues and a flexibility. Low demands on individuals, lots of choice, but then a commitment to moving forward. Okay. All right, so some of the benefits of knitting a movement are that it builds on independent organizations and relies on existing networks. It's a unity of vision, not necessarily of issues. Not everyone has to support the Fight for 15. Not everyone necessarily will be pro-choice, right? And so there's room for variation. There's a shared commitment against a common foe. There are proximal relationships that can be based on individual selection. And so there's plenty of ways that people can find their way to someone else. There are expanded opportunities for networks and partnerships across a broad range of diversities, including sexuality, party, ideology, and issues. It requires learning and engagement and is a deeper connection than a mere one-off march or some other sort of engagement. I still have miles to go, so I'm just going to tell you here. So I'm gonna wrap up so we can talk. What the data suggests from 2020, I just want to do just a couple of highlights and just say, I'm going to stop here, I think, or maybe go to my concluding slides. But what this slide shows is the Democrat minus Republican vote margins by racial group. And if you look in the bottom corner, I don't know if it's your left corner like it is for me, but you'll see for whites that there's a drop off between 2016 and 2017 of 3 percentage points. That shift, right? Whether it is that turnout for the Republican Party candidate dropped off, or that some share of those voters voted for, well, in this case, it is that they voted for a Democrat, that they voted for Biden, but that 3% is the difference between winning and losing. And it tells us quite a bit about the prospects for a multiracial coalition. It won't take everybody. There's lots more data that I could share. The issue is that the Republican Party this year had a white voter deficit. And we can talk about kind of where it happened. Let me say that it's white women in categories across education. The percent votes for Democrats actually increased relative to 2016, except for white non-college educated women. So that, while we might think that we need to be focusing on men here, it's actually the white women that we need to take a look at as well. I'm not gonna go through all of these, and I will just wrap up to say that what we're gonna see going forward is a shift amongst the Republican Party to really, if you can't beat them, then make them disappear, right? And so we're gonna see shifts in voting accessibility, purging of voter rolls, polling paces, all of the things that we saw played out in the last election, we're gonna see on accelerated going into redistricting this year and the elections in 2022, which are just gonna be a practice run for 2024. And so the part of the reason why we can say that demography is not destiny is if we just think of, again, apartheid. We might not be able to imagine a circumstance like that in American elections. It won't be as stark, but it could be just as effective in this country in reshaping the American electorate. So thank you for your time. Thank you, Cliff, for giving me some additional time. I look forward to a conversation.
Well, thank you, Valeria. You had a lot of information there that obviously will take some time to digest, but a lot to talk about. Okay, if you take down your screen share, I'd like to move on. We want to open the floor for discussion, for questions and comments. We have here in the Zoom room 20 people, but we also have some people who are viewing this on YouTube, and I'm sure that some of them will have questions also. So let me tell you how those on YouTube can get their questions or comments to us. Send them by email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And I will then pass the questions on to our speakers. For those of you who are with us in the Zoom room, you can put your questions more directly. I have you on screen share so I can see everybody. If you have a question that you want to raise or a comment, wave at me. You have to turn your video on so I can see you. And when I call on you, then you can unmute yourself and present your question or comment to Harry or Valeria. So who wants to go first? Who has a question or comment they'd like to start off with? Well, while you're getting your thoughts together, let me pose one on how to maintain a diverse coalition. Certainly the kinds of mechanics that were suggested would be helpful, but there are also problems of the kinds of issues that are raised. I mean, fusion politics was based on the notion that, well, we may have different issues, but we all share a common enemy, and so we can come together to fight that common enemy. But there are some issues that also can divide. I'm thinking, for example, of the demand for reparations. That's a particularly troublesome one because reparations means benefits targeted specifically for people of color and will be seen by other members of the coalition as taking away from them. And so it can end up being very divisive. I am surprised, for example, that in the case of Asheville, North Carolina, which Valeria knows because she did her undergraduate work there, Asheville made its way into national headlines when, as a result of Black Lives Matter, the city council unanimously passed a resolution to make reparations to African American residents of the city. And so that, Black Lives Matter brought people together in a surprising and bold way. But how has the call for reparations fared since then? Has the kind of unity that it asked for been able to sustain? I don't know if you can enlighten us on that, Valerie, or if Harry wants to address this question as well.
I can start and then hopefully Harry can chime in. I think that reparations is a kind of, it's the perfect question to ask about when you're considering issues or questions about unity in particular. So in North Carolina, after Black Lives Matter organizing, after the killing of George Floyd, what we did see is that the city council, not only did they move towards reparations, they apologized for Asheville's role in slavery and discrimination. So the apology too, was the apology and the discussion or really the vote to move towards reparations for Black North Carolinians. It was a unanimous vote, 7-0. And it was immediately met with some backlash from many. Asheville is a liberal town in the mountains of North Carolina. They have seen quite a bit, and it would be interesting to look at this more closely. Quite a bit of organizing as well from Moral Mondays activists and from the Poor People's Campaign. But it might be helpful to think about what it means for them to have passed this resolution. It is not about direct payments. Instead, the city will make investments in areas where Black residents in the city have faced disparities. So they're going to shift budgetary and programmatic priorities to increase Black home ownership, affordable housing, business ownership, and career opportunities, and really to try to address and stem the gap in generational wealth, right, between Blacks and whites. So these kinds of fundamental inequities are what they are trying to address. in some ways, their push towards reparations is reminiscent of what Black Lives Matter organizers were talking about when they were suggesting defund the police. Doesn't mean that the police necessarily will not have funding. It means to shift funds from policing populations to really protecting and serving populations, and then to be more thoughtful about where those other resources can go. And I'll be quiet about that here, and hopefully Harry has something, or others might, it is a challenge for unity. Immediately, the county says, no, we're not going to support it, right? The county is divided about it. But it also, I think, sets a standard for political possibilities. We ought to see more city councils, more local organizing around a reparations movement for African Americans. And I recently had a conversation about how that might work. And I've done a lot of work on trying to understand John Conyers' activism on reparations at the national level. So you may remember HR 40, which is so named for 40 acres and a mule, and has a potential to have another hearing in this coming congressional session. So we'll see. I will say this, that me personally, I think it's risky for this issue to be a litmus test on the Biden administration because it is divisive. But I think it can be strategic. I really think it could be an issue that could help Kamala Harris maybe to propel her forward if she's able to do it, maybe coming out of the Senate elections in 2022, which Democrats really need to win some seats if they want to maintain power. We're at such a razor's edge here nationally. So that at least gets us started. Harry, I don't know if you have any thoughts, or we can go back to Cliff.
Originally, I didn't, but you stimulated some thoughts that I have. First, I would like to, and I haven't, to look carefully at comments that Bernie Sanders has raised vis-a-vis reparations. And I think his concept was, as you suggest, to figure out ways to shift resources to communities that have been victimized by the history of white supremacy. In terms of the knitting metaphor, there are campaigns around the country to move the money. And it's not just from police budgets, but from military budgets to serving human needs. So, I think one could sort of conceptualize an interconnection between the idea of reparations and shifting our national resources. As to resolutions, and I don't mean to be cynical here, but resolutions are contradictory. I think the City Council of Greensboro, North Carolina, apologized for the assassination of 6 activists in 1979. And this week, the Cook County Board is showing the Fred Hampton video and then having a conversation about it. So I would look for Cook County to apologize for the assassination of Fred Hampton as well. And as with most life, this is contradictory. On the one hand, resolution making may supersede or serve as a substitute for serious shifting of resources. On the other hand, these apologies need to be made.
Absolutely.
And would the FBI also apologize?
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, now there are heroes.
Right. Right.
Could I jump in with a quick comment?
Yes, go right ahead, Jay.
All right. It's good to see you guys. Thanks so much, Valeria and Harry, for the interesting talks. I'm sort of curious about the effects of Moral Mondays already and this movement. To my ear, when I hear the themes of the Biden administration and when I actually see the nominations and the diversity there in very visible positions, I'm thinking, boy, this is hard to track, but it seems like a lot of mainstream Democrats now in governing positions are at least echoing, it's hard to gauge how genuine these commitments are, but it seems like there's been some success, at least at a rhetorical level. I mean, would you agree with that, when we're assessing this movement? And it may well be that to the point that was raised by Cliff about the need for, and you raised, Valeria, about the need for some oppositional thing to push back from as a way to bind yourself. Okay, well, who knows what's going to happen with Trump himself? Okay, he may be thrown off, the public radar for a good bit, and Trumpism is sort of in disarray on the Republican side. It's the party itself is very much a mixed bag now. So, is the movement kind of losing that unified target to push back from? And while simultaneously maybe needing to do a victory lap because of its accomplishments. And so does it seem like maybe, that may put the brakes on future mobilizations?
Right. I love it. That's a great question. I'm so glad this is recorded, so I don't have to remember all of this, but so I can look back on it. So here's what I think. I think that the reason why we're talking nationally about the Fight for 15 is in part because Moral Mondays and the Poor People's Campaign amplified their message over the last year. Biden's administration has met and had conversations with William Barber as a representative of the Poor People's Campaign. So did Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, I think, actually set the tone, the track for this by meeting very early in, I want to say at IU at Bloomington but it might have gotten canceled. I can't remember. But he certainly was scheduled to meet with Reverend Barber during the presidential campaign. So there's a way that has actually happened. That the New Poor People's Campaign connected with the presidential campaign to push forward a set of issues that I think you're right. There's been some success here, and success, right, can have a double-edged sword. You want it, but it might slow your momentum. The challenge, though, that Barber is bringing up repeatedly is that neither candidate in the general election, he would argue, took poverty seriously, or took the kinds of significant steps that are required to alleviate poverty in the nation. And so certainly I think that Biden has tried to be responsive and will continue to be so, but Barber is still trying to keep his foot on the gas on that issue. In relationship to Trump, I think that is a challenge. What happens when your most prominent foe seems to be kind of maybe on the ropes, except that it's not, I don't think that that's the right way to read this moment, particularly coming out of the January 6th insurrection, which we haven't talked about at all yet. But again, the complicity of the Republican Party with both the insurrection and with the big lie over the last year and what is going to come. What we saw in Georgia was that a coalition of a multiracial coalition, youth, women activists, they beat the runoff, which is a miracle. It is designed to be impenetrable, and somehow they eked out a win for 2 Senate races, and we should expect to see the heavy hand of suppression coming down over the next several months. And that is going to galvanize voters as much as it tries to reshape and push them out. And so I would expect to see just a continued battleground going forward into next year. And in fact, I think it's going to be even more dangerous, right? So your coalition partners are even going to be even more at risk. So yeah, great question.
I would add one that Moral Mondays is sort of reconceptualized itself as New Poor People's Campaign, right? And there are organizations in many states around the country. And I'm told in the Bay Area, there's relatively strong Poor People's Campaign. There was a relatively strong one in Milwaukee in Wisconsin, and their relative strength relates to their capacity to work in coalition, and it varies from place to place. And I too would echo, I was going to say something about Georgia. Political scientists typically, as Jay and Valerie know, count things. And I think it's probably pretty difficult to assess the impact of Moral Mondays and Reverend Barber on the extraordinary grassroots multi-organizational mobilizations in Georgia. There's Surge, there are various other groups that were active on the ground in Georgia. To some degree, the AFL-CIO has heard Reverend Barber, and the list goes on. And that's difficult to measure, but the seeds are planted, and I raised the idea of the history of the labor movement, not because organized labor has always been anti-racist, but sectors of it have. And the spirit of that multiracial worker organizing lives on, not in ways that we can easily measure, but it lives on, and the seeds are planted. And Moral Mondays and New Poor People's Campaign are part of this process of mobilizing for radical change.
Okay, we have a question that has come in from a YouTube viewer. Let me see if I can put it up on the screen. It comes from philosopher Doug Morris.
Oh.
He thanks both of you, but then says, I recall hearing Richard Levins talk about how in Cuba, it was possible to have rational discussions about health, healthcare, farming, education, infrastructure, organization, etc., because nobody could walk in the room and ask, but how will that impact profits? In the US, he found it very difficult to engage in rational discussions, especially at Harvard, which was where Levins was, because someone would always ask about profits. Well, Doug is wondering about the impact of living in a society culture dominated by capital in the US, and how that might make it more difficult to knit together rational coalitions. As we know, fear and greed are deeply inculcated in the culture of capital, so that people see other people as a source of exploitation for gain, and they fear others as possible threats to success. Looking at people in this manner, aside from being detestable, suggests another level of difficulty in organizing and mobilizing. Okay, on the possibility of rational discussion.
I could start, and in part, I want to say a big shout out to Doug. He's a wonderful philosopher and folk singer as well. And we've met on several occasions at conferences. I opened with drawing the inextricable connection between class and race. And I truly believe that. And if we're to defeat exploitation and human inequality, ultimately we have to defeat capitalism. And if we are to end racism, ultimately we have to defeat capitalism. But that's a long-term, obviously, a long-term project. And it seems to me, using the levels of analysis framework, it suggests that there are a multiplicity of different levels at which people can engage in constructive action, from changing political institutions, and immediately, in some of Valeria's data indicates, challenging voter suppression and redistricting, at the cultural level, celebrating new music and films that, artists are, as Doug knows full well, are struggling to overcome the old stereotypes that have dominated American culture. And also at the social psychological level, challenging people to change their conceptualizations of superiority and inferiority. And so it's a multi-level project. And these various coalitions that we've talked about are engaged in the struggles at various levels. And we just have to keep on keeping on. And, eventually we'll win, because we're on the right side of history.
I can only hope so. I want to just show, if I can show you all something just really quickly. I took over the screen, so just for a second. But I just wanted to show you the data on the left-hand side of the screen, hopefully. But I think we're already in the middle of a way to answer that question. We've seen it. What happens in this country when we ask voters, who will they support? Who would they vote for? Or really, how did ideas about the coronavirus or rebuilding the economy fit into their presidential decisions about who they would vote for? And those who wanted to contain who thought containing the coronavirus was the most important issue, voted almost at 80% for Biden, whereas almost the same number who thought that it was about that rebuilding the economy was more important, voted for Trump. And so to me, I think this is, I'm gonna stop sharing. To me, it's a kind of a case study in thinking about the kind of challenges that we face in this country about, what about the money? Who's going to get it, right? So not just how does it affect the economy, but how's it going to affect my pocket? And it's really easy to activate people in this country with the idea that some people deserve support and others don't. And one of the mainstays of support for Donald Trump is, of course, evangelical Christians, which are really, and pastors have been really important in helping people to frame both opposition to Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act under Obama, as well as now in support for Trump. And this whole idea, even perhaps they don't do the QAnon kind of craziness, I'm sorry to say, but perhaps they don't go that far with these pastors, but they really do push people to blindly support policies that are related to individual rather than collective self-interest.
Cliff, can I just add something? My friend Paul Kreebill and I wrote an essay that I posted on my blog, Commercial Time, Diary of a Heartland Radical. And in it, we addressed the question of the role and complicity of the Democratic Party in the shift to the right over the last 30 or 40 years. Mm-hmm. I've recently, while in lockdown here, read Rick Perlstein's book, Reaganland, and Ryan Grimm's book on American politics. And both of them address the rise of Reaganism from the mid-70s on. Reagan supporters created a fusion politics that brought together disenchanted workers and evangelicals and people who were homophobic and right-wing sectors of the economic ruling class. And Reagan was their preferred attractive candidate. And Reaganomics, I think, dramatically affect American public policy ever since. And from my point of view, Bill Clinton gave it legitimacy on the center and the left. And so there's, at least since the mid-70s, and probably we could extend the analysis back to the Nixon era too, and the Southern strategy. But at least over the last 30 years, both political parties have moved to the right. And we could see just by relationship, economic inequality has increased over this period of time. Union membership has tanked, has dropped off immeasurably. The gaps between white and Black income earners has declined. Mass incarceration has increased enormously. And we could go on and on. And this was a historic process, a shift towards what some people call neoliberalism, that both parties are complicit in. And so as we organize, and I was excited that Biden defeated Trump, and I root for Democrats. I kind of have a crush on AOC, but that's my own thing. But I think the squad within the conventional political process represents a really creative vision as best as can be achieved within the political process. But I think our worldview has to include this kind of analysis of both mainstream political parties. And I remember once in Cuba, one of our presenters from Cuba said that the United States is a one-party state with two wings or something to that effect. And there's that
Right
element.
wings.
Yeah, right. So I just wanted to added that and not let the Democrats off the hook.
Can I add something real quick? Because I know I think we're over time, but if I may, I would just say that Barber organized his very first marches for HK on J and the Forward Together movement under Democratic, North Carolina was a Democratic state, right? With some shifts in the state legislature, but it had a Democratic governor. And in states like Indiana, North Carolina, and other places, a Democratic elected official is not the same as a progressive elected official on the East Coast or the West Coast, right? And so we're not talking about progressives, we're talking about conservatives. And so I just wanted to kind of just put an exclamation point beside Harry's point, and just to briefly say that that there is still, I think, opportunity for coalition building, but we cannot take for granted that the circumstances that presented themselves this year will continue. We have to be really thoughtful about that 3% drop off for the Republican Party. It was decreased margins is what they experienced. And in part because people stayed home. Maybe they were afraid to go out and vote, or they believed the lie about the election being stolen. But you're not going to be able to count on that in 2022. And so we need to really be thinking about how to solidify real connections with working class people across racial and ethnic backgrounds in a way, hopefully, that is able to knit together this movement. And I have to think about it more carefully related to the question. It's a good question. That one is I think that, that's the place where it could run aground. If I can address it, I think that's important.
White racism has, been a very divisive factor, and somehow or another has to be overcome. And I was struck by a article appeared in yesterday's New York Times, "The Way Out of America's Zero-Sum Thinking on Race and Wealth." It's by Heather McGhee, who has just published a book, "The Sum of Us: What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together." She points out that that if you look, for example, at the history of desegregation struggles in the 1960s, in order to prevent the integration of public facilities throughout the South, local governments and states closed the facilities. As a result, you have empty swimming pools where neither blacks nor whites can swim now. And basically what she's arguing is that we need to find public goods programs that benefit blacks and whites alike, and point out that without them, we're all impoverished more, and perhaps that kind of demonstration effect would be more powerful than any arguments in overcoming white racism.
If I can jump in here, I think the critical key, that's a perfect article. And I need to get the book. There we go. But it speaks directly to my research. But I think one approach would be targeted universalism, right? I think it is something that comes out that we saw in action in the Obama administration. It's a small example. And I'll kind of go back and say what it is, but I'll tell you the example first. So you remember when the Obama administration took action against food deserts, right? So it was done out of the First Lady's office, not the president's office. It was her issue. And it was about addressing food deserts, particularly in impoverished parts of the country, and in rural areas, right? But it was targeted. So it's a universal issue that could address food deserts in Appalachia just as much as it could in the Mississippi Delta. But it was targeted in such a way that minority populations were ensured to actually benefit from it. Very much unlike policies that are presented as simply universal, like home ownership after World War II. I mean, we know those kinds of examples that mostly benefited whites and not, and where discrimination and segregation were built into the policies themselves.
Right.
And so we could take an approach that is targeted universalism, where it's an issue or a policy that can address the needs of many, and where it focuses greater resources to those who are most in need, right? And that, I think, is one way to actually get at the kind of to kind of sneak in your vegetables, right? To kind of sneak the broccoli into the casserole in a way that people will take it going forward. Yeah. So.
Well, are there any last questions that we haven't touched on yet? Actually, there are a lot.
I
but,
just have one question, and that is to repeat the email address for Dr. Tark, so we can get all the visuals.
Okay.
Targ, T in lowercase, TARG at Purdue, PURDUE.edu. As you can tell, Purdue is a hotbed of radicalism.
It sounds like it.
All the people on the call.
Thanks very much. This was helpful. And a friend of mine, I just sent this to, I hope he'll listen to it, because his belief has been that the Democrats really need to emphasize where class is a part of the current struggle in a way that they haven't. And he's been very much against identity politics and thinks that's pulled us away from winning. And so I'll be curious to see what happens as we go on. Thanks very much. I appreciate being able to be a part of this. Thanks.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And I'm sure Cliff is going to remind you all that this video will be posted on the center website, right?
Exactly. Exactly. This recording and all previous webinars are available for viewing on the website globaljusticecenter.org. And I know
Stephen,
that
I think, has a comment too before you finish.
there aren't perhaps a lot of people watching it on YouTube now, but in coming weeks, we find that lots of people will watch it later. It'll be up there for you. I mean, it's not uncommon to get close to 100 people who will watch it later.
Oh, cool.
Very good.
Okay, another comment? Yeah, Steve.
Well, if there's time for a last question, but then I can always hold on to this and maybe
Go ahead. I don't think anyone's in a rush.
All right. So, from your insight and interest in the political process that has unfolded recently, especially around the elections, tied to the kind of social concerns that we have. So what are your insights in terms of various kinds of social organizations and movements? What are your insights in terms of their future plans to keep the Biden administration honest between now and the next election?
I think, hello, Stephen's another dear friend. I know that this is complicated, and there's a specific example that I want to refer to. We spend some of our time in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where our daughter lives, and I joined a group called Wisconsin Peace Action. And Wisconsin Peace Action was invited by a number of other groups to mobilize a protest Tuesday evening when Joe Biden is coming to Wisconsin to give a presentation. And these are people who are demanding action on, opposition to, or a demand to change policy towards Cuba and Venezuela and Iran, which I agree with, demands for Green New Deal, demands for more immediate action on against police funding, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess I'm of mixed mind myself, because I really think that Biden's stimulus package is terribly important to get through Congress. And while I remain a Biden and Democratic Party skeptic, and am committed to the survival and change of US policy towards Cuba and on and on and on, I think maybe now is the time to support the good side of Biden's proclamations. And so, this is not a sort of philosophical or theoretical answer, but a reflection of my own troubled, contradictory to reaction. On the one hand, as a socialist, as an anti-imperialist, I expect Biden to do things that I would profoundly disagree with. On the other hand, the stimulus package, his response to the COVID epidemic, I think on balance are progressive steps. And we need to figure out ways to support those.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to jump in here. I think that's a perfect example too of maybe knitting movements. So this should surprise Harry, but I'm actually thinking, sure, go on and do the protests. But if it's possible to also provide the support, I don't think that Biden gets to do the kind of work that we want him to do. Harry often talks about an inside-outside strategy, and I think that you need an inside and outside strategy. So he's going to need for people to push him, but not to mortally wound, right? And so that's why my concern is that an issue like reparations or kind of these other questions, that they not be litmus tests, but that they remain kind of in the arena of issues that are important to a sizable portion of Biden's electorate, excuse me, so that he can't dismiss it and he has to grapple with it even if he gets it wrong. But that at the end of the day, we recognize that that the options that we have for moving forward are not wide open. And that we probably aren't going to find our ideal, that anytime you have an elected official, when they have to compromise and negotiate, that we need to be thoughtful about helping them to make the right decisions about where compromise work and where it won't. And so I actually think that the protest can continue as long as we also don't use it as a litmus test to say, I'm never going to support this administration. That is what will not, I think, sustain any coalition building or even a movement forward.
Good.
My sense of the kind of conditions is that, the options are never, ever going to be wide open. There's always going to be contestable, because that is the nature in the ways in which power is distributed, in our society. At the same time, I think that, in these elections, I'm also mindful of the kind of Democratic Party's actions, in terms of even Bernie Sanders earlier on in the campaign and so forth, So there are lots of unhealthy kinds of conditions that emerged then. But I'm thinking also, in the more positive kind of light, is that there were organizations left, right, and center, cross-section of the American society, institutions and organizations that had come together and did the work in order to be able to, get this electoral win. And so in that process, they have established a lot of capital, currency. The question is, what if they do not leverage that capital and currency that they have? We go back to the kind of form of American politics and political social agency that is once every 4 years type of thing, and in between, nothing else. So my question in a kind of way also relates to, the various kinds of organizations and, to keep the pressure on in some ways. This is what I mean by, how do you keep the Biden administration honest? You do keep in mind in the nature of the way power is, so that there's never an open field. But the fact that there is never an open field does not mean that we cannot apply pressure to friends as well as foes at another time.
Mhm.
And if the friends can't take the pressure, they're not our friends and not our allies in the
Yes.
first place.
Mhm.
So that is
Okay.
where I come from with this question, because I think that it's not what happened in yesterday that's important. It's what happens today and tomorrow.
Well, can I jump in here? Like, I'm thinking about, first of all, that's a great set of questions and ideas to think about. And this is going to be not nearly enough to address it. But I am thinking about Biden's response to Kamala Harris. So one of the issues that I think is, you don't kill the people on your team, right? Even if you're competing against them, you still want them to be standing when you're finished.
Sure.
And the critique that Kamala raised against Biden could have been deadly, right? That is to say,
Mhm.
you supported segregating schools, or you did not support desegregation when you ought to have, right? And so it could have been deadly, and it might have been exactly the knockout punch that she needed. And it certainly elevated her, right, in the national mind. But what I see about Biden, surprisingly, is that he actually chose her as his running mate. That gives me some hope, right? I do find Biden, surprisingly, is more progressive than I think I would have imagined even a year ago, 2 years ago. Certainly more so than Barack Obama, and probably more so than Hillary Clinton. And so I think that we're moving in the right direction. So and that his response to Kamala Harris's, I think, deadly blow might be indicative of how he can work. And let me just say, like, I think about as well how we can be more strategic as organizers for the conversations that occur behind doors, right? I think that those, both taking to the street is important, as well as the kind of negotiations that you're going to get. They might not get you everything that you want, but if they're moving you in the right direction, then that ought to count. And I think we need to start having conversations as individuals and groups that are mobilizing and organizing movements about that is really going to help us to be more, I don't know, for lack of a better word, strategic in how we're going to make gains, because it's not an all or nothing. And we often use you either for us or against us. That might not be true. You're either on the right side of this or you're not, and we need to be helping you move in the right direction, because there's two trains running, right? If you think about August Wilson, there's two trains, and you're gonna have to get on one of them. So
Good.
Well, I think with that, we need to wrap up our discussion today. I want to thank Valeria and Harry for their sharing their ideas and their data with us, and remind everyone that you can see these, you can review all of this on our website because it was recorded. Next week, we have another very special webinar on the unchecked growth of presidential power, featuring two speakers from the Center for Constitutional Rights. We're coming out of a period of runaway presidential power with Trump, but in fact, the problem has been with us for much longer than just the last 4 years, and it has become structured into the legal system of the United States. So that's what will be discussed next week. Hope you'll be back with us 1 o'clock next Monday. The following week, we will have a panel looking at imperialism in the global South, with focus on Africa and Latin America. So come back for these and other exciting webinars that we have planned. I want to thank you all for being with us today. And so this is Cliff Durand signing off for now.
thank you so much. Bye,
Thank you all. Thanks, Harry, Valeria.
Bye.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
It was good.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Cliff, thank you for a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it.
It was
Thanks.
great. Thanks
Yeah.
all.
You were awesome, Valeria.
Likewise,
Thanks.
it's hard to follow you. My goodness, this is so